Venezuela is back in the news with the visit of Maria Machado to the White House to meet President Trump. She will also meet senators later today. Obviously, Venezuela has been a massively contentious issue since the American operation that deposed Nicolas Maduro. To discuss this today, I'm joined by Alex Avina. He is an associate professor of Latin American history at Arizona State University. Alex, thanks for joining us. Let's get right into this. Maria Machado, when Maduro was deposed, was on social media saying that she was ready to take power, or some phrase to that effect. And obviously that didn't happen. She was shut down, I would say, fairly rapidly by Trump, who opted instead, for the moment, for continuity in the shape of Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president. Do you think there's any real possibility of Machado sort of bringing the Trump people back to her side, or fundamentally changing the dynamics here?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. No, not in the immediate future. I think we need to remember that Maria Corina Machado, the way that she's represented now throughout the world, is not the way that she's been seen historically in Venezuela. In Venezuela, she has a pretty far-right political history. She signed on to the 2002 Carmona decree during that short-lived coup against Hugo Chavez. And she's called for street violence. She's been at the head of far-right political rallies against then President Hugo Chavez, and then Nicolas Maduro after the death of Hugo Chavez. So I think we need to keep in mind, one, that the figure that we see represented, particularly in the Western media, is not entirely accurate in terms of who she has been politically in the past. And second, it's really interesting that someone near, and we saw this in that first press conference the morning after the abduction of Maduro, that someone close to Trump had the foresight to tell Trump, and then he repeats this during the press conference, that Machado, I don't have the direct quote, but it's something like, Machado doesn't have the respect of the Venezuelan people, so we're essentially not going to ride her in on top of Abrams tanks into Venezuela. And that was exactly correct. So I think that reflects some level of geopolitical and political understanding within the Trump cabinet in terms of what reality on the ground in Venezuela looks like. And for now, for them, the smart move is to keep the current government in power, now just under the leadership of Delcy Rodriguez.
And to that point, you mentioned about Machado's political history and so forth. She had also been pretty explicit, if I'm not mistaken, in calling for U.S. military intervention. Would there have been a risk? Is there still a risk of her being seen as a kind of patsy for Trump or for the American administration in that regard?
I would think that that's how she's seen. It was the strangest thing to witness and listen to a Nobel Peace Prize winner actively call for the bombing of her own country, and then go on to these other meetings with business leaders talking about, as soon as I get in there, we're going to privatize the economy, and this is going to be an economic paradise for all. So yeah, I think that's one way that she is being seen now from within large circles of civil society in Venezuela. This also goes back to the mid-2000s. There's a famous picture of her, I think from 2005, 2006, of her in the White House meeting with then President George W. Bush, and she has a wide grin. And that actually brought a lot of mockery and criticism from Venezuela after she had a meeting with the president that was widely understood to have played some sort of role against the attempted coup against the Chavez government in 2002. So again, I think she's a really weak figure, and people within the Trump cabinet understood that. And that's why they're willing to work with the current president, Delcy Rodriguez, as for them, the easiest, quickest, cheapest way to get what they want, which it seems to be they want Venezuelan oil, and they want to, perhaps being seen as having control over Venezuelan oil also allows them to enact a certain form of control over the global oil market and global oil flows, which I think is a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I did want to talk to you more about that, because this is a very unusual intervention in terms of the way Trump is justifying it. We could have, of course, a very long historical argument about places where America has intervened. But generally speaking, there is a pretext given for those interventions that isn't simply about getting the resources of the country. The Iraq War, rightly or wrongly, was justified on the basis of WMD and to some extent democracy promotion, Afghanistan, countering the threat of terrorism, all the way back to Vietnam and the idea that that was going to stop a kind of communist domino theory. In this instance, Trump seems very forthright in saying, we're there to get the oil. How do you think that is received in Venezuela?
There's two conversations going on, right? So Trump is telling the international media and he's telling the American populace that he, quote unquote, runs Venezuela, that he controls Venezuelan oil, and that all of Venezuelan oil will be, sold by the United States, and the proceeds will be put into U.S. controlled international banking deposits, right? That's one conversation going on. But then if you listen to the current Venezuelan government, what they're saying is we've always wanted to establish peaceful diplomatic and economic relations with the U.S. government. And what we're seeing now is simply an extension or an expansion of the current deal that we have with Chevron, which is a particular license that the U.S. government has permitted or allotted to Chevron, so Chevron could continue to operate in Venezuela. So there's two conversations going on, but it is very clear that Trump, I've lost track of how many different excuses or justifications they've used to go into Venezuela. But the one consistent one was oil, right? And I think we should believe what they're telling us in that regard, particularly if you're following some of the legal proceedings against Nicolas Maduro. I mean, that indictment against him, the 25-page indictment against him, is very weak. It has no mention of fentanyl trafficking. The Justice Department completely dropped any mention of the mythical Cartel de los Soles that he was supposedly the head of, and that's why there's a $50 million bounty on his head. Most recently, I read a filing from the Justice Department yesterday that essentially made a humanitarian intervention argument in terms of why they went in to abduct Maduro and then take him to the Southern District in Manhattan. So I think the one constant reason, without any sort of ideological mask, which is a trademark of Trump, is oil and control over global oil flows, particularly if they're thinking about going to war or attacking Iran, which would then have an effect on oil flows in West Asia.
I want to get back, as we begin to sort of wind this up, sort of putting the people of Venezuela in the center of this discussion in a way, because, you mentioned previous rather dubious endeavors like the coup the coup attempt, the brief coup against Hugo Chavez, and you mentioned Machado's lack of legitimacy, I suppose. It also seems to me that there's pretty incontrovertible evidence that Maduro stole or fraudulently claimed victory in the 2024 election. And as we were talking about, Delcy Rodriguez was his vice president. So in terms of there being any real advance here for the people of Venezuela, how would that come about? I mean, it seems to me that what we have now is a situation where Trump is saying we're going to take the oil, but on the other hand, you still have a representative of the government that was being criticized for being undemocratic or illegitimate or whatever. So the people of Venezuela seem to be in a bad spot to me.
Yeah, it's in the era of, I guess we're in the era of post-hypocrisy, and the Trump administration is okay with living with these hypocritical contradictions, right? The idea that they had to remove Nicolas Maduro, but the government remains in place. In the short term, that this operation, this abduction of Maduro, makes it really difficult for the political opposition within Venezuela, because fundamentally the concepts at play here are national sovereignty and self-determination, and the U.S. violated those concepts in Venezuela. So generally in Latin American history, when these things tend to happen, perpetrated by U.S. empire, civil society, then these civil populations tend to, close rank around their government, right? Because their government then can use nationalism and the concept of national sovereignty to kind of rally support around them. So in this operation, actually, the Trump administration made it difficult for any sort of political opposition trying to mobilize in Venezuela since the elections of 2024. And as we talked about already, it dramatically weakened the already weak position of someone like Machado. Now, the interesting question to me will be if the Delcy Rodriguez government continues to work with the Trump administration in a productive way, will this then lead to the removal of the sanctions that have been catastrophic against the Venezuelan people? For me, that is the main story here. These sanctions that were they've had some sort of economic sanctions since the early 2000s, but the ones that were implemented and intensified by the Trump administration during his first term are responsible, according to several studies, for the deaths of tens of thousands of Venezuelans, perhaps even more. Their economy suffered a contraction 2 to 3 times that of the U.S. Great Depression of the late 20s and early 30s. And many Venezuelans responded by fleeing, including what we saw yesterday apparently in Minneapolis. A Venezuelan refugee was shot in the leg by ICE, which kind of connects the domestic to the foreign. So if there's a diplomatic and economic relationship continues in a peaceful way, relatively peaceful way, between Venezuela and the U.S., will this allow for an easing or removal of sanctions that represent a form of economic warfare against all of Venezuelan people, not just against government officials? And that's what I'm going to be watching out for.
And if that did happen, that would be a silver lining to what you obviously consider an illegal action, really, on the part of the United States.
We know. I mean, it's economic warfare in the form of these sanctions, unilaterally imposed sanctions, are illegal under international law, and they've been they've caused massive suffering in the country of Venezuela. So and this would be one of the ironic, products of this entire operation. If this thus leads to an easing of sanctions, this once again reveals kind of like the very crass materialistic reasons that motivate some aspects of Trumpist foreign policy. In this instance, ideology would not necessarily matter as much to them as getting Venezuelan oil would be. And then if that leads to an easing or removal of sanctions, I mean, I think that would be, well, for me, it would be an unexpected way to have gotten to that end of sanctions and economic warfare against Venezuela, which are against the entire Venezuelan people.
One final question, Alex, and then we'll let you go. In relation to the broader picture of Latin America, obviously there has been talk about the deposing of Maduro, leading in turn to some sort of attempt to oust the government of Cuba. And we have heard Trump joke about how it sounds good for Marco Rubio to be the next leader of Cuba and all of that. Just talk a little bit about what you see happening and what you see the dangers being in that scenario.
It would be catastrophic for the region if, building upon this abduction operation, the U.S. decided to initiate regime change operation attempts in Cuba or in other countries that they've put on notice, like Colombia or even Mexico. I cannot imagine, economic sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela are responsible for millions of people leaving their countries and becoming refugees, right? They were robbed of the right to stay home because of these economic sanctions. Any sort of regime change operation in any other Latin American country will produce a similar phenomenon. People will leave because they're trying to survive, and they will be robbed of the right to stay home. For Latin America, I think these other different Latin American leaders should be on notice. But at the same time, the fact that Trump went into Venezuela in this very special forces abduction operation raid, I think can also signal the weakness or potential lack of political and military capacity for the U.S. government to do what they say it wants to do in relation to Latin America. So it's kind of, for me, as an analyst, it's really difficult to balance out the strength and the weakness, right? The fact that they went in there and took Maduro, but didn't put boots on the ground or any other type of extensive military operation kind of signals like the limits, or kind of gives us some hints about the limits of U.S. military and political capacity in the region. But nonetheless, it can still produce a lot of mass suffering through more limited operations. Cuba, I think, is unfortunately number one on their priority target hit list. But I can't even, it would be catastrophic for the region. It would have repercussions beyond this small island nation that has been on some sort of defensive war footing against the U.S. since 1961 with the Bay of Pigs.
Alexander Avina, Associate Professor of Latin American History at Arizona State University. Thanks for joining us on the Niall Stanage Show.
Thank you so much for having me.